The secret ingredient, the horror at the rusty spoon. Think about the last time you grabbed takeout. You handed over your card, took the heavy paper bag, and trusted that whatever was inside was safe. We all do it. It is an unspoken contract we make every single day. But in the fall of 2019, in a quiet, sprawling suburb just off Interstate 71 Inches, Ohio, that contract wasn't just broken, it was completely shattered. And honestly, it started so quietly that nobody even noticed. Which brings us to Mark. Mark Evans was a 4-year-old EMT. He was the kind of guy who practically lived on stale gas station coffee and 4-hour shifts. He was tired, he was stressed, and he had a very specific routine. Every Tuesday night, after clocking out at 2 a.m., he would drive exactly 4 miles down a dimly lit county road to a 4-hour diner called the Rusty Spoon. It was a local institution, the kind of place with faded vinyl booths, a buzzing neon sign that was always missing, a letter, and the constant smell of fried onions and bleach. It felt safe. It felt like home. Mark would always sit in the same corner booth, order a black coffee, and get the diner's famous slow-cooked meat pie. It was cheap, it was heavy, and it did the job. And on this particular Tuesday, that is exactly what he did. He was sitting there, scrolling through his phone, barely even looking at his plate. The diner was empty, except for a couple of truckers at the counter. The waitress, a sweet, older woman named Brenda, had just refilled his mug. Mark took a large bite of the pie. And that is when it happened. A sharp, jarring crunch echoed in his head. It wasn't the soft crumble of pie crust or the chew of overcooked beef. It was hard, like biting down on a rock. Mark froze. He instinctively spat the bite into a crumpled paper napkin. At first, he just felt annoyed. He assumed it was a piece of gristle or maybe a rogue bone fragment that the kitchen had missed. People make mistakes, right? At that point, it made sense to just brush it off. But as he looked closer under the harsh fluorescent lights of the diner, his annoyance slowly shifted into a deep, sinking confusion. Sitting in the center of the napkin wasn't a pebble. And it wasn't a standard piece of animal bone. It was a small, perfectly curved fragment, about 1.5 inches long. But that wasn't the disturbing part. Embedded directly into the side of this bone fragment was a tiny, unmistakable piece of surgical steel. It looked exactly like a miniature orthopedic pin. Mark stared at it, his medical training kicked in, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. Because he knew, even then, that you do not find surgical pins in a cow. He wrapped the napkin tightly, shoved it into his jacket pocket, and walked out without saying a word. He told himself he was overreacting. But the truth was, the nightmare had already begun. The drive back to Mark's apartment was a blur. He lived in one of those sprawling cookie-cutter complexes just off Interstate 95, the kind where every building looks exactly the same. He sat at his cramped kitchen table, pushed aside a pile of past-due bills and junk mail, and carefully unrolled the napkin. And honestly, looking at it under the cheap yellow overhead light of his apartment, the fragment looked even worse. He grabbed a pair of tweezers from his EMT trauma kit and scraped away the remaining bits of cooked meat. The bone was dense, about 1.5 inches long, and the metal pin was threaded, designed to screw directly into marrow. Mark didn't sleep that night. By 8 a.m., he was exhausted, running on fumes and a pot of stale coffee. He decided to call his buddy Dave, who worked as an inspector for the county health department. Mark explained the situation, expecting Dave to sound horrified. But Dave just sighed. At that point, Dave offered an explanation that actually made perfect sense. He told Mark that Earl, the owner of the Rusty Spoon, was notorious for cutting corners. Beef prices were up, so Earl had started buying cheap, uninspected feral hog meat from local hunters out in the county woods. Dave explained that sometimes hunters used tracking dogs, and those dogs often got injured by the boars. A local vet would pin their broken legs back together. Dave figured a piece of a deceased hunting dog or maybe even a farm pig that had undergone a veterinary procedure accidentally got mixed into the meat grinder. It was a massive health code violation, sure, but it was just a cheap diner being greedy. Mark felt a massive wave of relief wash over him. It was disgusting, absolutely vile, but it was a logical, mundane explanation. He wasn't dealing with a horror movie, he was just dealing with a lazy restaurant owner. Mark agreed to drop the bone fragment off at the health department later that afternoon so Dave could issue a citation. But the truth was about to violently collapse. Before putting the fragment into a plastic evidence bag, Mark took a cotton swab and some rubbing alcohol to clean the grease off the metal pin. As the surgical steel shined under the light, he noticed something he had missed. There was a microscopic engraving near the head of the pin. It was tiny, barely an eighth of an inch wide. Mark used the macro lens on his smartphone, zooming in as far as the camera would allow. The engraving read, NTO7. Mark sat frozen. He opened his laptop and typed the code into a medical database he used for EMT training. He thought it would pull up a veterinary supply company. It didn't. The search results instantly populated with a catalog from Novatech Orthopedics, a high-end medical manufacturer based in California. The page displayed the exact threaded pin sitting on his kitchen table. It was a phalangeal fixation pin. And right there in bold black letters was the manufacturer's warning for human use only. Designed exclusively for the stabilization of adult finger fractures. The relief Mark felt 10 minutes ago completely vanished, replaced by a suffocating, icy dread. He hadn't eaten a piece of a farm pig. He hadn't eaten a hunting dog. He stared at the empty space on the napkin, his stomach violently turning as the horrific reality set in. Mark barely made it to the bathroom. The realization hit him like a freight train. He collapsed next to the toilet, the cold porcelain pressing against his cheek as his stomach violently emptied itself. He stayed on the bathroom floor for what felt like hours, shivering, his mind racing through the horrific implications. He hadn't just eaten a bad burger. He had consumed human flesh. He didn't call Dave at the health department again. He dialed 911. When the dispatcher asked what his emergency was, Mark honestly didn't know how to say it without sounding insane. I think I just ate someone, he stammered. Within 20 minutes, 2 county sheriff's deputies were standing in his kitchen, looking at the tiny metal pin through the plastic evidence bag. They ran the Novatech serial number through their own forensics database. 10 minutes later, a patrol car was screaming down Route 9 towards the Rusty Spoon. When the police walked into the diner, the lunchtime rush was in full swing. Families were sitting in vinyl booths, eating the exact same chili burgers Mark had ordered. The deputies shut the place down immediately, ordering everyone to drop their forks and step outside. They marched straight into the kitchen. And honestly, you'd expect them to find a dungeon. You'd expect Earl to be some deranged serial killer hiding bodies in the walk-in freezer. But the truth was so much more pathetic, and somehow, so much more disturbing. When the deputies cornered Earl in his cramped, cigarette-stained back office, he didn't even try to run. He just looked exhausted. And that is when they noticed a teenager, maybe 19 years old, sitting on a milk crate by the dish pit. His name was Toby. He was a local kid Earl paid under the table to clean the kitchen. Toby was cradling his right hand, which was wrapped in a filthy, blood-soaked towel. 3 days prior, Toby had been cleaning the industrial meat grinder while it was still plugged in. His hand slipped. The auger caught his heavy rubber glove and pulled him in. He lost his index and middle fingers right there on the stainless steel prep table. But Earl didn't call an ambulance. His workers' comp insurance had lapsed months ago, and he knew a hospital visit would bring OSHA crashing down on his restaurant, likely shutting him down for good. So Earl wrapped the kid's hand in gauze, handed him $200 in cash, and told him to keep quiet and go home. But what about the meat? There was 40 pounds of premium ground chuck sitting in the hopper when Toby's hand went through the blades. To Earl, throwing away 40 pounds of beef meant losing about $150. And Earl was notoriously, obsessively cheap. He couldn't stomach the financial loss. So he just mixed the contaminated meat into the rest of the batch, added extra chili powder to mask any metallic taste of blood, and served it as the weekend special. Mark spent the next 6 months living in an absolute nightmare. He had to undergo a grueling battery of blood tests at the local clinic, checking for hepatitis, HIV, and every blood-borne pathogen you can imagine. The physical tests came back clean, but the psychological damage was permanent. He lost 15 pounds. Every time he drove past a fast food sign, he felt a wave of nausea. He couldn't even look at a barbecue grill without his mind flashing back to that tiny surgical steel pin covered in grease. The Rusty Spoon was boarded up for good. Earl was sentenced to 4 years in a state penitentiary for reckless endangerment and tampering with evidence. The community tried to move on. But there is one detail from the police report that still haunts Mark to this day. You see, Toby had been in a bad dirt bike accident a few years back. The doctors had reconstructed his hand using surgical pins. According to his medical records, there were a total of 4 phalangeal fixation pins in his severed fingers. When the police seized the remaining meat from Earl's freezer, they sifted through every single patty. They didn't find any more pins. Mark only found one. Which means somewhere out there in that quiet suburban town, 3 other people finished their meals. 3 other people wiped their mouths, paid their tabs, and went home, completely unaware of what they had just swallowed. The brass key. The mundane mistake that sank a titan. We all know the story. The unsinkable behemoth. The freezing Atlantic. The band playing on the slanted deck as the stern rose into the night sky. It is the most famous maritime disaster in human history. For over a century, we've blamed the ice. We've blamed the captain's arrogance, the severe lack of lifeboats, and the reckless speed of the vessel through a known ice field. And honestly, if you read the official inquiry transcripts from 1912, that is exactly the narrative you are supposed to believe. But the truth is, disasters of this magnitude rarely start with a massive cinematic collision. They start quietly. They start with a mundane, everyday mistake, a misread memo, a rushed handover, or in this case, a guy packing his bags in a hurry, completely unaware that he was sealing the fate of over 1,500 people. Pause. To understand what actually happened out there in the dark, we have to go back, not to the freezing ocean, but to a damp, foggy morning in Southampton, England. April 1912. Meet David Blair. David is 37 years old. He's a career mariner, a guy who has spent his entire adult life working his way up the ranks of the White Star Line. And right now, he is having the absolute best week of his life. He has just been appointed as the 2nd officer on the newest, largest, most luxurious ocean liner ever constructed by human hands. For weeks, David has been living and breathing this ship. He's been overseeing the final preparations, making sure the navigation equipment is calibrated, double-checking the inventory. It's tedious, unglamorous work. You can imagine him sitting in his cramped cabin, drinking stale, lukewarm coffee, checking off cargo manifests under the dim, buzzing glow of an incandescent bulb. One of David's specific responsibilities is the ship's optical equipment, the binoculars. Out on the open ocean, especially at night, binoculars are the only early warning system a ship has. There's no radar, there's no sonar, just 2 guys freezing in a crow's nest, staring out into the blackness, relying on magnified glass. Because the ship is still in port, and there are hundreds of contractors, dock workers, and crew members swarming the decks, things have a habit of walking off. So, David does what any responsible officer would do. He takes the ship's high-powered binoculars, locks them securely in a wooden cabinet in the crow's nest, and slips the small 3-inch brass key into the pocket of his heavy wool uniform coat. It's a totally normal thing to do. Think about how many times you've slipped your house keys or your car keys into your pocket without even registering the movement. It's pure muscle memory. And at that point, it made perfect sense. The binoculars were safe. David had the key. The grandest ship in the world was set to sail in just a few days. But then, the corporate machine stepped in. It's April 9th, less than 24 hours before the maiden voyage. The executives at the White Star Line make a sudden, 11th-hour decision. They are nervous about the sheer, unprecedented size of this new vessel, so they decide to bring in a more senior officer from a sister ship to act as chief officer. Because of this sudden corporate shuffle, everyone in the senior staff gets bumped down a rank, and David Blair? He's the odd man out. He is abruptly removed from the crew roster. Imagine the crushing disappointment. You've spent weeks preparing this magnificent vessel. You've bragged to your family, your friends, and less than a day before you're supposed to make history, your boss taps you on the shoulder and says, "Sorry, David, pack your things. You're not going." David is devastated. And honestly, he's probably pretty angry. He goes to his cabin, he starts throwing his belongings into his canvas duffel bag, he's rushing. He just wants to get off the ship, get away from the awkward, pitying stares of his colleagues, and go home. He strips off his working coat, packs his gear, and hastily briefs his replacement, an officer named Charles Lightoller. It's a messy, rushed handover. A 15-minute tense conversation over a cluttered desk littered with shipping charts and half-empty teacups. David grabs his bags, walks down the gangway, and steps back onto the cobblestone docks of Southampton. He watches the massive black hull of the ship towering over him, probably feeling a bitter mix of relief and profound loss. What David Blair doesn't realize as he walks away, what he won't realize until days later, when the horrifying news hits the telegraph wires, is that he forgot to hand something over to his replacement. Sitting at the bottom of his coat pocket, entirely forgotten in the emotional chaos of his sudden firing, is a tiny 3-inch brass key, the only key to the binocular locker. The 10th of April, 1912. The grandest ship in human history pulls away from the docks of Southampton. The crowds are cheering, the brass bands are playing, and deep in the bowels of the ship, the massive engines hum to life. For the first few days, everything is perfect. The voyage is a triumph of modern engineering. But as the ship pushes further into the North Atlantic, the atmosphere begins to shift. Fast forward to the evening of April 14th. Imagine being Frederick Fleet or Reginald Lee, the two lookouts assigned to the night watch. You've just climbed a 50-foot steel ladder in the freezing dark to reach the crow's nest, a tiny exposed metal basket swaying high above the deck. The wind is biting, cutting right through your heavy wool coat. Your job is simple but critical. Stare out into the pitch-black ocean and look for danger. Naturally, the first thing Fleet does is reach for the wooden locker where the binoculars are supposed to be kept. He jiggles the handle. It's locked tight. He calls down to the bridge. He asks the officers for the glasses. But down on the bridge, Charles Lightoller, the officer who hastily replaced David Blair, is coming up empty. He searches the drawers, sifts through the cluttered desks, but he can't find the key. He probably assumed the binoculars were packed away in the cargo hold, or maybe misplaced during the messy, rushed handover in Southampton. And honestly, at that moment, nobody panicked. They just brushed it off. This is where the false sense of security really takes hold. If you look at the standard operating procedures of 1912, the officer's reaction makes total logical sense. The prevailing belief was that lookouts should rely entirely on their naked eyes to spot an object. Binoculars, they argued, narrowed your field of vision too much. They were only supposed to be used to times confirm, times what you had already seen. Besides, they were standing on 46,000 tons of unsinkable steel. And the weather? It was absolutely perfect. There was no moon that night, but the sky was remarkably clear, completely packed with stars. The ocean was dead calm, flat as a piece of glass. The crew figured that if there was a massive block of ice in their path, it would be impossible to miss. They would see the stars blocked out by its massive silhouette. They would see the white foam of waves crashing against its base. They didn't need binoculars, they had perfect conditions. But that comforting, logical explanation was about to shatter. Because the truth was, those perfect conditions were actually a death trap. The fact that the ocean was completely flat wasn't a blessing. It was a fatal curse. Without wind or swells, there were no waves to crash against the edges of the icebergs. There was no white foam to catch the starlight. It was just dark ice sitting motionless in dark water. And it gets worse. The ship was sailing into a region where the freezing Labrador Current collided with the warmer Gulf Stream. This extreme temperature drop created a phenomenon known as a thermal inversion, a cold water mirage. The freezing air literally bent the starlight, creating a false horizon that crept up into the sky, camouflaging everything behind it. Up in the crow's nest, Fleet and Lee are staring out into a pitch-black abyss, their eyes watering from the freezing wind. They are trying to pierce through a visual distortion they don't even know exists. If they had those high-powered binoculars, they could have cut through the mirage. They could have magnified the faint, starlit outline of the threat miles ahead. They would have had minutes to react instead of seconds. But they don't. Because hundreds of miles away, back in England, a disappointed man named David Blair is sitting in his home, completely unaware that the 3-inch brass key resting in his coat pocket has just doomed them all. And right now, the ship is barreling forward at 22 knots, about 25 miles per hour, straight into an invisible, frozen minefield. At exactly 11:40 p.m., the mirage finally breaks. Up in the freezing crow's nest, Lookout Frederick Fleet's eyes widen. Out of the pitch-black abyss, a massive dark shadow suddenly materializes in their path. It isn't white. It isn't gleaming. It's a black mountain of ancient ice, dead ahead, and it's less than a quarter of a mile away. Fleet lunges for the brass bell, striking it 3 sharp times the universal warning for danger ahead. He grabs the telephone, his hands shaking from the biting cold, and screams down to the bridge. "Iceberg, right ahead!" First Officer William Murdoch immediately orders the wheel hard over and throws the engine telegraph into reverse. But physics is a cruel master. You cannot simply stop 46,000 tons of steel barreling forward at 25 miles per hour. It takes agonizing, breathless seconds for the massive rudder to even begin to turn the ship. They almost clear it. Almost. And here is where the reality of the disaster severely diverges from the movies. There was no massive cinematic crash. There was no explosive impact that threw people out of their beds. In fact, most passengers barely noticed it. Survivors later described it as a faint shudder, a dull, grinding noise like a giant finger dragging along the side of the hull. One passenger said, "It sounded like tearing a piece of calico cloth." Down in the boiler rooms, the stokers saw a sudden spray of freezing water, but up in the first-class cabins, people just rolled over and went back to sleep. And honestly, that is the most terrifying part of this whole story. The sheer, quiet normalcy of the moment they were doomed. Because below the waterline, the ice wasn't slicing the steel open like a can opener. The immense pressure was simply popping the iron rivets out of the hull plates. The seams buckled, and the freezing ocean began pouring into 5 separate watertight compartments. When the ship's chief designer, Thomas Andrews, was called to the bridge to assess the damage, he didn't need a long time to figure it out. The math was brutally simple. The ship was designed to stay afloat, with up to 4 compartments flooded. But 5? 5 meant the bow would be pulled down, and the water would simply spill over the bulkheads into the next compartment, and the next, and the next. It was a mathematical certainty. The unsinkable ship was going to the bottom of the ocean. And it is only now, as the distress rockets are fired into the indifferent, star-filled sky, that the full, crushing weight of history sets in. Because this isn't just an anonymous vessel. The ship, bleeding out in the freezing dark of the North Atlantic, is the RMS Titanic. Think about the sheer emotional horror of the next 2 hours. The realization creeping through the grand staircases and the third-class steerage, the 2 8-degree water so cold it felt like 1,000 knives piercing the skin, slowly rising deck by deck. The horrifying realization that there were over 2,200 souls on board and only enough lifeboats for half of them. And then, think about David Blair. Days later, Blair is sitting in his quiet, safe home in England. He probably has a cup of morning tea or stale coffee on the table. He unfolds the morning newspaper, and his heart stops. The bold black ink screams the unimaginable. Titanic sinks. 1,500 dead. He reads the horrifying accounts. The lack of warning. The lookouts who couldn't see the iceberg until it was too late. He reaches into his coat pocket. His fingers brush against cold, heavy brass. The 3-inch key. Did David Blair sink the Titanic? No. The thermal mirage, the speed, the flat ocean, the brittle iron rivets, it was a catastrophic cascade of failures. But human minds don't process tragedy like a math equation. We look for the what if. What if Blair had remembered to hand over the key? What if Fleet and Lee had those binoculars? What if they had seen the black ice just 10 seconds earlier? 10 seconds is all it would have taken to turn the rudder just a few more feet. 10 seconds to save 1,500 lives. Blair kept that key for the rest of his life, a heavy, silent ghost in his pocket. Today, 2.5 miles down at the bottom of the North Atlantic, the Titanic rests in total, crushing darkness. Deep inside the decaying wreckage, buried in a collapsed officer's cabin, there is a small wooden locker. Inside that locker, perfectly preserved in the freezing depths, sits a pair of high-powered binoculars. They have been waiting there for over a century, waiting for a little brass key that never came. The impossible shot, the yellow Camaro mystery. Imagine you are driving down a perfectly flat, sun-baked stretch of interstate. It is 2:14 p.m. on a Tuesday, broad daylight. You are in a bright yellow 1978 Chevy Camaro. The windows are rolled up tight against the Texas heat, the AC blasting. There are no other cars within a quarter mile. And then, out of nowhere, you just die. No screeching tires, no erratic swerving. Your foot simply slips off the gas, the car drifts lazily into a drainage ditch, and that is it. When the paramedics arrive, they assume it is a heart attack. A tragic, mundane medical emergency. But then they roll you onto the stretcher, and they find it. A perfectly circular, .38 caliber hole in the back of your head. No exit wound, no shattered glass anywhere in the car. No one heard a gunshot. Welcome to what investigators still call the weirdest murder case in American history. But before we get into the impossible ballistics of it all, we need to talk about the man in the Camaro. His name was David. He was 42, a mid-level regional manager for a paper supply company, living in a quiet subdivision just outside of Austin, Texas. And honestly, David's life was the definition of ordinary. The morning of June 12th started like any other. We know this because investigators meticulously reconstructed his last 24 hours. They found a half-empty mug of stale coffee on his kitchen counter, right next to a stack of unopened junk mail, mostly credit card pre-approvals, and a flyer for a local hardware store. He had kissed his wife goodbye at 7:30 a.m., complained about the humidity, and drove to work. He was the kind of guy who kept a meticulous ledger of his gas mileage in the glove box. He was not involved in gangs. He did not owe money to the mob. He was just a regular guy looking forward to mowing his lawn on the weekend. Which brings us back to 2:14 p.m. David was leaving a client meeting, cruising down Route 290 at exactly 55 miles per hour. A highway patrol officer, Deputy Miller, happened to be parked on the gravel shoulder running radar about a half mile away. Miller did not hear a pop. He did not see a muzzle flash. He just saw the bright yellow Camaro slowly drift across the solid white line, rumble over the shoulder, and nosedive into a shallow embankment. It was so slow, so anticlimactic, that Miller did not even hit his sirens. He just flipped on his lights and rolled over, expecting to find a guy who fell asleep at the wheel or maybe had low blood sugar. Miller walked up to the driver's side. The car was still in drive, the tires spinning lazily in the dirt. David was slumped over the steering wheel, no blood on the dashboard, no visible trauma, just a guy taking an involuntary nap. And at that point, it made perfect sense. A medical episode. But when Miller opened the heavy metal door and reached in to check for a pulse on David's neck, his fingers brushed against something wet. Hidden just beneath David's hairline, at the base of his skull, was a small, neat puncture wound. The kind of hole that completely shattered the quiet afternoon. A bullet wound inside a sealed car with absolutely no explanation. When Deputy Miller felt that warm, sticky blood at the base of David's skull, the entire nature of the scene shifted. It wasn't a medical rescue anymore. It was a homicide investigation. Within 20 minutes, that quiet stretch of Route 290 was swarming with flashing red and blue lights. Crime scene tape was strung up between the scrub oaks, flapping lazily in the heavy 8-degree Texas heat. And honestly, when the crime scene technicians first arrived, they assumed it would be an open and shut case, a drive-by shooting on the highway. It happens. It's tragic, but it makes physical sense. You look for the shattered window, you dig the bullet out of the dashboard, you check the asphalt for shell casings, but as the tech team began processing David's yellow Camaro, that sense of routine completely evaporated. First, they checked the windows. Both the driver and passenger side windows were rolled up tight. The air conditioning was still blasting cold air into the cabin. There was no shattered glass on the upholstery, no spiderweb cracks in the windshield. So they checked the body of the car. They ran their hands over the heavy steel doors, the trunk lid, the rear bumper, looking for a puncture. Nothing. Not a single scratch on the bright yellow paint. At that point, the lead investigator, a 20-year veteran named Detective Harris, arrived on the scene. And Harris did what any logical detective would do when faced with an impossible external shot. He looked inward. If the bullet didn't come from the outside, it had to come from the inside. It's a dark thought, but it was the only explanation that held water. David must have pulled the trigger himself. Maybe the stress of his mid-level management job got to him. Maybe that ledger in the glove box hid financial ruin. They began tearing the interior apart. They checked under the heavy rubber floor mats. They sifted through the crumpled fast food wrappers in the passenger footwell. They emptied the center console, pulling out nothing but a handful of sticky pennies and a spare tire gauge. They were looking for a gun, a .38 caliber revolver, maybe a small semi-automatic pistol. They found absolutely nothing. Which brings us to the collapse of the suicide theory. Later that evening, the county medical examiner, Dr. Evans, conducted the autopsy. He recovered the bullet, a slightly deformed .38 caliber slug lodged deep in David's frontal lobe. But it was the trajectory that made Dr. Evans pick up the phone and call Detective Aris in the middle of the night. The bullet had entered the exact center of the back of David's head, right at the medulla, and traveled on a slightly upward trajectory. Think about the physics of that for a second. Try to imagine a man driving 55 miles per hour down a highway, reaching around to the back of his own head with a .38 caliber handgun, angling it upward, pulling the trigger, and then, what? Throwing the gun out of a closed window? Swallowing it? It was physically impossible. So, if it wasn't suicide, there was only one other logical option left on the board. The passenger theory. Someone else was in the car with David. Someone sitting in the back seat who quietly raised a gun, pulled the trigger, and bailed out of the moving vehicle before Deputy Miller arrived. It made sense. It felt like a solid, grounded theory. Until Detective Aris went back to the impound lot to review the vehicle logs. When Deputy Miller first approached the Camaro, the doors weren't just closed, they were locked. From the inside. The electronic locks were engaged, and the rear doors had the child safety locks switched on. Furthermore, the thick layer of Texas dust on the back seats was completely undisturbed. No one had sat back there in weeks. So there they were. Investigators were staring at a locked metal box. A man had been shot in the back of the head with a .38 caliber bullet. The gun wasn't inside the car. The bullet couldn't have come from outside the car. There was no ghost passenger. It was a locked room mystery doing 55 miles per hour down a Texas highway. And the truth, when they finally uncovered it, was so bizarre, so statistically improbable, that they had to Brauhausist just to prove it actually happened. It took 3 weeks and a team of forensic engineers to finally look under the car. And honestly, you can't blame Detective Aris for missing it. You don't look for a gunshot wound to originate from the asphalt. But when they put that yellow Camaro on a hydraulic lift at the county garage, the impossible suddenly became physical. There, just behind the rear axle, punched through the rusted metal of the undercarriage, was a hole. A perfect, hidden circular hole no wider than a pencil eraser. They traced the trajectory. The bullet had traveled up through the floorboard, pierced the thin metal of the trunk pan, passed cleanly through the foam stuffing of the driver's seat, and entered the base of David's skull. But how? A. .38 caliber bullet doesn't just fire itself from the highway, which brings us to a 19-year-old kid named Michael living exactly 1.2 miles away from Interstate 45. That afternoon, Michael was in his backyard, messing around with his grandfather's .38 caliber revolver. He wasn't aiming at the highway, he wasn't aiming at anything in particular. He just pointed the gun at a makeshift target on a dead tree stump and pulled the trigger. But he missed. The bullet struck a rusted cast iron pipe buried in the dirt. And at that exact moment, physics took over. The bullet ricocheted off the iron. It launched into the air at a steep angle, traveling in a massive parabolic arc over the Texas scrubland. It cleared a line of oak trees, it crossed over a mile of empty fields, and right as it began its descent, losing speed but still carrying lethal kinetic energy, it met Interstate 45, at the exact millisecond that David's yellow Camaro passed over that specific patch of asphalt. The bullet didn't drop onto the roof. It ricocheted a second time off the concrete highway, bouncing upward just as the Camaro drove over it. It punched through the rusted floorboard, through the seat, and into David. A true locked room mystery solved by a 1 in a trillion freak accident. When Detective Eris finally drove out to Michael's house and explained what had happened, the kid just collapsed on the front porch. He hadn't even known. He had been eating dinner with his family while David was bleeding out on the steering wheel. And that's the part that really lingers. The emotional aftermath of a truth this bizarre. For David's family, there was no villain to hate. No grand conspiracy to unravel. Just a cosmic, terrifying roll of the dice. You send your husband off to work, and he doesn't come home because a teenager missed a tree stump a mile away. It strips away the illusion of safety we all build for ourselves. You can lock your doors, you can wear your seatbelt, you can drive exactly 55 miles per hour, but you can't control the random geometry of the universe. And honestly, there's one final detail that Detective Eris still thinks about years later. When they checked David's receipt from the fast food drive-thru he had visited just before getting on the highway, they noticed the timestamp. David had been handed his change, a handful of sticky pennies, and he had fumbled with them, dropping one between the seats. The cashier remembered him putting the car in park, unbuckling his belt, and spending exactly 12 seconds fishing that penny out from under the emergency brake. 12 seconds. If David had just left the penny on the floor, if he had merged onto the highway 12 seconds earlier or 12 seconds later, that .38 caliber bullet would have hit empty asphalt. Instead, he arrived at that exact square foot of highway at the exact millisecond required to intercept a falling piece of lead. Sometimes the scariest stories aren't the ones about monsters or serial killers. Sometimes they're just about a yellow car, a hidden hole, and a 12-second delay. The Echo Chamber, the ironic death of Marcus Vance. If you were to pull the Highway Patrol report from the 14th of October, 2004, it reads like 100 other tragic accidents on Route 315 out of Columbus, Ohio. A 1,998 Ford Taurus. A slick patch of asphalt. A sudden loss of control at 65 miles per hour. But what the sterile, typewritten report doesn't mention is what the paramedics found sitting on the passenger seat, dusted with shattered safety glass. It was a manuscript, 300 pages of heavily annotated drafts written by the driver himself. A manuscript dedicated entirely to proving that the exact mechanism that just caused his death was a manufactured hoax. And honestly, when you realize who was behind the wheel, the story stops being a standard roadside tragedy. It becomes something almost uncomfortably ironic. Something that makes you wonder if the universe has a very dark sense of humor. Is less than BR, is greater than is less than BR, is greater than. The man in the driver's seat was Marcus Vance. If you read any local investigative pieces in the late 90s, you probably knew his byline. Marcus wasn't one of those polished, TV-ready journalists. He was the kind of guy who practically lived in a cramped, poorly lit office above a strip mall, surviving on stale black coffee from the diner next door and cheap antacids. His desk was an archaeological dig of junk mail, half-empty styrofoam cups, and stacks of Freedom of Information Act requests. He was deeply flawed, often missing his daughter's soccer games because he was chasing a lead, but he genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. He saw himself as the ultimate skeptic. The guy who would protect the American public from corporate overreach. For the last 2 years, Marcus had been consumed by a singular obsession. He was convinced that a major safety initiative, one that was being heavily lobbied for in Washington, was actually a multi-million-dollar scam designed to prey on consumer fear. He wouldn't shut up about it. He'd corner his editors, waving dog-eared printouts, arguing that the statistics were manipulated. He felt he was on the verge of the biggest expose of his career. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. Which brings us to the morning of the 14th. It was a Tuesday, unseasonably cold, with that heavy gray Midwestern sky that makes everything look a little washed out. Marcus was running late. He had a meeting downtown with a whistleblower, someone who supposedly had the smoking gun documents he needed to finish his book. As he backed his Taurus out of his suburban driveway, crushing a pile of damp autumn leaves, there was a sound. A sharp, metallic clink, followed by a faint, rhythmic vibration right beneath the steering column. Most people would have pulled over. Most people would have checked it out. But Marcus had spent the last 24 months convincing himself that the automotive industry was lying about this exact type of mechanical failure. He had internalized his own reporting so deeply that he actually believed the danger was statistically impossible. So he just reached over, turned up the volume on the radio, and merged onto the highway. He didn't know it yet, but that little vibration was the sound of a very real, very fatal reality catching up to him. 10 miles down Interstate 90, that faint, rhythmic vibration had evolved into a dull, persistent shudder. You know that feeling when you're driving at 65 miles per hour and something just feels off in the floorboards? It travels up through your boots, settling right into your teeth. Marcus felt it. He gripped the cold, faux leather steering wheel a little tighter, his knuckles turning white. But he didn't slow down. He was too busy rehearsing his interview questions, muttering them aloud over the sound of the morning radio traffic report. End. Honestly, you can almost understand his mindset. When you spend 2 years of your life staring at corporate memos and convincing yourself that a specific mechanical defect is a complete fabrication, a phantom menace invented by lobbyists to push a multi-million-dollar mandatory, recall you refuse to see the ghost when it's sitting right next to you in the passenger seat. N by 8:22 a.m. The shutter became a hard, aggressive pull to the right. The car was actively fighting him. N. Now, any normal person would have thrown on their hazard lights and pulled over to the shoulder. But Marcus needed a logical, mundane explanation that didn't threaten his entire worldview. He rationalized it. Of course he did. He told himself it was just a bad alignment. He remembered hitting a massive pothole outside the diner a few weeks back, the kind that rattles your teeth and spills your coffee. Or maybe it was a warped brake rotor. Yes, that made perfect sense. It was an old car, with over 120,000 miles on the odometer. Cars get old, parts wear out. It was just a routine maintenance issue, nothing more. He convinced himself he could just muscle it to the downtown exit and drop it off at a mechanic after he got his smoking gun documents. N. It's terrifying how easily we can rationalize our own impending doom just to protect our ego. And the real collapse of his reality happened exactly 3 miles later at the exit 42 off-ramp. It's one of those sweeping, downhill cloverleaf curves that forces you to lean heavily into the turn. Marcus eased off the gas, dropping his speed to about 45 miles per hour, and firmly turned the steering wheel to the right. N, but the Taurus didn't turn. N. The heavy, reassuring resistance of the steering column vanished instantly. The wheel just spun in his hands, completely loose, rotating freely like a plastic toy on a playground. There was a sickening snap, the unmistakable sound of the steering linkage completely shearing off from the axle. End quote. In that fraction of a second, the truth shattered his false explanation. The mythical defect, the exact one he was about to expose as a statistical impossibility in his upcoming book, was happening right now in his own car. He slammed on the brakes, but physics had already taken over. 2 tons of American steel plowed straight ahead, ignoring the curve of the ramp. The car burst through the metal guardrail with a deafening metallic shriek, launching into the steep, weed-choked embankment below. The world turned into a chaotic blur of shattered safety glass, deploying airbags, and the violent, bone-rattling impact of the car slamming into a thick concrete drainage culvert. Then. Silence. Just the hiss of a punctured radiator and the smell of burnt gunpowder from the airbag deployment, and Marcus was bleeding, disoriented, and trapped in the crushed cabin. But miraculously, he was still breathing. He had survived the impossible crash. As he sat there, coughing in the smoke, a twisted sense of relief washed over him. He was alive. But what Marcus didn't realize as he reached for the door handle was that the crash wasn't the tragedy. The crash was just the setup for the darkest, most ironic punchline the universe could possibly deliver. Marcus pushed against the driver's side door. It was wedged shut, crumpled against the thick, immovable concrete of the culvert. No big deal, he probably thought. He'd just climb over the center console and get out through the passenger side. He reached down to unclick his seatbelt. He pressed the red button. It didn't move. He pressed harder, his thumb turning white with the strain. Nothing. The plastic button was completely rigid, feeling as though it had been welded into the metal housing. And honestly, this is the part of the story where the universe stops being random and starts feeling downright malicious. You see, the steering linkage failure wasn't the only anomaly Marcus was dedicating his book to debunking. The whistleblowers leaked documents, the very ones Marcus was so desperate to prove were fabricated, detailed, a fatal, cascading failure. The claim was that when the Taurus experienced a severe front-end collision, the immense kinetic energy would warp the floor pan just enough to jam the seatbelt retractor and fuse the buckle mechanism completely shut. Marcus had spent an entire chapter of his upcoming book tearing this specific claim apart. I actually have a copy of the original manuscript right here. On page 142, he calls the jammed seatbelt theory, quote, a convenient excuse for panic-induced user error by negligent drivers looking for a quick payout. But, sitting in the smoky cabin of his wrecked car, panic wasn't the issue. Physics was. Under the crumpled hood, a spark from the severed battery cable danced across a pooling puddle of leaking power steering fluid. A small, bright orange flame flickered to life. Suddenly, the situation escalated from a bad accident to a ticking clock. Marcus began to pull frantically at the nylon webbing of the belt across his chest. The official police report, Case File 88, Delta notes severe friction burns on his palms and fingers. He was fighting for his life against the exact safety device he had spent the last 8 months defending in print. The fire spread quickly, feeding on the dry, weed-choked embankment and the car's synthetic oil. The cabin began to fill with thick, acrid black smoke. It's chilling to pause and think about those final few minutes, the sheer, suffocating weight of the realization that must have washed over him. He wasn't just dying, he was being murdered by his own arrogance. As the heat intensified, spiderwebbing the windshield glass, Marcus was forced to stare down at the passenger floorboard. Scattered across the rubber mats were the printed drafts of his manuscript. The very pages where he called the auto manufacturer the victim of a witch hunt were now curling, browning, and catching fire. He was trapped in the exact, statistically impossible death trap he had staked his entire career on disproving. By the time the county volunteer fire department arrived on the scene, it was over. The Taurus was nothing but a charred, smoldering husk of American steel. The emotional fallout of this case is something that still haunts the local investigative community. When the first responders finally cut the roof away with the jaws of life, they didn't just find a tragic accident victim, they found a man whose right arm was fully extended toward the glove compartment, his charred fingers frozen just 3 inches away from the latch. Which brings us to the final, sickening aftershock of this whole story. During the post-crash investigation, detectives popped open that melted glove box. Inside, sitting perfectly intact beneath a pile of old registration papers and unpaid toll tickets, was an emergency glass breaker and seatbelt cutter tool. It was a cheap, promotional freebie Marcus had received at an automotive safety convention the year before. He had the tool to save his own life, but the defective seatbelt, the one he swore on his reputation would never fail, held him exactly 3 inches too short to reach it. And the ultimate irony? 6 months after his funeral, his publisher decided to release his book anyway. They marketed it as his final unfinished masterpiece. So today, right now, you can log online and buy a hardcover copy of Marcus's book. You can flip to page 142 and read a dead man arguing with absolute, unwavering certainty that the exact mechanical failure that burned him alive is nothing more than a myth. The odor in apartment 114, human beings have this built-in alarm system. It's an evolutionary trait, sort of hardwired into our DNA to keep us from, dying. Out of all our senses, smell is the one that bypasses logic and goes straight to the primitive lizard part of your brain. When you smell something rotting, your body physically reacts before your conscious mind even processes what it is. You recoil. Your stomach turns. It's your brain screaming at you to get away. But what happens when you can't get away? What happens when that smell is seeping into the one place you're supposed to be the safest? N.N. Before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. We upload once or twice a week, so please sneak into the like button's house, replace all of their regular coffee with decaf, and then hit subscribe and turn on all notifications. So, let's set the scene. It was the middle of July in 2017 in a sprawling, sort of cookie-cutter apartment complex just outside of Tampa, Florida. If you've ever been to the Gulf Coast in the dead of summer, you know the heat isn't just hot, it's heavy. It's like walking around wrapped in a wet 90-degree blanket. The air conditioning units in these three-story stucco buildings are constantly fighting a losing battle against the 100% humidity. Enter Mark and his fiancée, Jessica. Mark was a guy who worked long hours doing HVAC repair, ironically enough, and Jessica was an ER nurse. They were just your average hardworking American couple living in a ground floor unit, apartment 114. And their life was pretty routine. Wake up early, grab a stale cup of coffee from the drip machine, commute through the endless suburban sprawl of strip malls and roadside diners, work a 10-hour shift, come home, watch some TV, and go to bed. And honestly, they liked it that way. The complex was quiet, mostly young professionals and retirees, no loud parties, no real drama, just a safe, boring place to live. But then, on a Tuesday evening, things started to shift. Mark came home from a grueling shift. He was exhausted, smelling like Freon and sweat, and as he put his keys in the door, he paused. There was this smell. It was faint, really faint, lingering right in the breezeway outside their door. He sniffed the heavy, stagnant air. It was this sickly, sweet, garbage-like odor, kind of like if you left a package of raw meat in the trash can out in the sun for a few days. He figured, one of the neighbors probably just forgot to take their trash down to the dumpster, or maybe a stray animal had dragged something under the palmetto bushes. It wasn't a big deal. He went inside, took a shower, and forgot about it. N. But by Thursday, the smell hadn't gone away. In fact, it had gotten stronger. And worse, it wasn't just outside anymore. When Jessica came home from her nursing shift, she immediately wrinkled her nose. "Did you forget to take the trash out?" she asked Mark. Mark checked the kitchen bin. Empty. They checked the fridge. Nothing spoiled. They even got down on their hands and knees, shining a flashlight under the sofa and the heavy appliances, thinking maybe a mouse had gotten in and died behind the drywall. That happens all the time in these older Florida apartments. N. At that point, it made sense. A dead rodent in the walls is gross, sure, but it's a normal, everyday annoyance. It's a logical explanation. But the truth was, it wasn't a mouse. And that uncomfortable gut feeling they were both trying to ignore, it was completely justified. Because that awful smell was just the very beginning of a nightmare. By Saturday morning, the smell had sort of mutated. It wasn't just a faint background odor anymore. It was this thick, physical presence in the apartment. You know that feeling when you walk into a closed room and the air is just heavy? It was like that, but you could almost taste it on the back of your tongue, this greasy, metallic film that made your stomach churn. Mark ended up driving to a local Home Depot and buying 3 cans of industrial-strength deodorizer, the heavy-duty stuff he used on nasty HVAC jobs. Jessica had Bath & Body Works candles burning on literally every flat surface, but it wasn't working. The stench seemed to be seeping directly out of the AC vents. So Mark, being an HVAC guy, gets out his ladder and pops the grate off the central intake in the hallway. He shines his flashlight up into the ductwork, expecting to see a nest or something. He doesn't see anything, but the smell up there is absolutely blinding. He climbs down and tells Jessica, "Look, it's the middle of summer in Florida. A raccoon or maybe a feral cat probably crawled into the main ventilation shaft to cool off, got stuck, and died." And honestly, at that point, that made perfect sense. It's a super common, albeit disgusting, problem in these sprawling suburban apartment complexes. They called the property management office, and by Saturday afternoon, a maintenance guy named Dave showed up. Dave poked his head into the drop ceiling, sniffed the air, and nodded. "Yep," he said, "that's a dead animal. Probably a fat raccoon in the crawl space between floors. I've seen it 100 times. He sprayed some chemical deodorizer into the vent, told them pest control would be out on Monday to fish the carcass out, and advised them to just keep running their bathroom exhaust fans. For a brief moment, there was this huge sense of relief. A dead raccoon is gross, sure, but it's a known variable. It's a logical explanation. Mark and Jessica spent Sunday trying to ignore the lingering odor, ordering takeout, because the thought of cooking in that environment was completely nauseating. They figured they just had to tough it out for one more night. But then came Monday morning. It was around 4 a.m. Jessica's alarm went off for her early ER shift. She rolled out of bed, exhausted, and walked into the master bathroom. The second she crossed the threshold, the stench hit her like a physical punch to the face. She immediately doubled over the sink, dry heaving. The chemical deodorizer Dave had sprayed was completely overpowered. But as she stood there, gripping the edges of the porcelain sink, trying to catch her breath, a really uncomfortable realization washed over her. Jessica was an ER nurse. She had been around death. She knew exactly what a decaying body smelled like. A dead rodent in a wall smells like bad cheese and dusty decay. But the thing is, this was entirely different. It was sickeningly sweet, thick, and smelled heavily of copper and iron. It was the undeniable, distinct chemical signature of rotting human tissue. Her heart started to pound in her chest. She slowly stood up and looked around the small bathroom, trying to find the source. That's when she looked up at the ceiling. Right above the bathtub, on the pristine white drywall, there was a stain. It hadn't been there the night before. It was about 6 inches across, a dark, rusty brown circle, and the drywall around it looked damp and swollen. And right in the dead center of that dark stain, a single, thick, viscous droplet was forming, preparing to fall. Whatever was dead wasn't in the ventilation shaft. It was directly above them, in apartment 214. That single, thick, viscous droplet hung there for a second, trembling against the swollen drywall, and then it fell. It hit the pristine porcelain of the bathtub with a heavy, wet time smack. Jessica didn't scream. She didn't even gasp. She just slowly backed out of the bathroom, her hands clamped over her mouth, and practically sprinted into the bedroom. She shook Mark awake, and when he groggily asked what was wrong, she didn't say anything about raccoons, or maintenance, or pest control. She just looked at him, completely pale, and said, "Call 911. Right now, someone is dead upstairs." When the police arrived about 10 minutes later, they didn't bother with the property manager. 2 officers went straight up the exterior stairwell to the second floor, while Mark and Jessica stood down in the chilly morning air of the parking lot, huddled in their jackets. From down below, they could hear the officers knocking on the door of 214. "Police department, open up!" There was a long, tense silence. Then they heard the heavy, unmistakable crack times, of a door being kicked off its hinges. Mark and Jessica waited by their car for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 15 minutes. Finally, one of the officers came slowly walking back down the stairs. He had a pale, tight look on his face, and he was actively wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He walked over to them and said, very bluntly, "You two need to pack a bag. You can't stay here." The building is a crime scene. It wasn't until 3 days later, after bouncing between cheap motels and friends' couches, that they finally got a call from the lead detective on the case. And the reality of what they had been living under was so much worse than they had imagined. The tenant in apartment 214 was a 40-year old man who kept entirely to himself. But he hadn't died of natural causes. He had been brutally murdered. His body had been dragged into his bathroom and left on the floor directly over Mark and Jessica's bathtub. The fluids from his advanced decomposition had seeped through the grout, into the subfloor, and eventually through Jessica's ceiling. But as the detective was explaining this, Mark stopped him. "Wait," Mark said over the phone. "You said advanced decomposition. How long was he dead?" "The coroner estimates about 3 weeks," the detective replied. Mark felt all the blood drain from his face. A cold, heavy dread settled in his stomach. That's impossible," Mark stammered. "We heard him pacing around up there just 2 nights ago. Heavy, dragging footsteps. We heard him walking from the living room to the bedroom." There was a long, uncomfortable silence on the other end of the line. The kind of silence where you can practically hear the other person trying to figure out how to break terrible news to you. "Mark," the detective finally said, his voice dropping an octave, "the victim lived alone, and based on the lividity and state of the body, he absolutely died 3 weeks ago. He hasn't taken a single step since." The detective paused, taking a slow breath. "But you're right about the footsteps. When our forensics team processed the apartment, we realized the killer didn't just murder him and flee, they stayed. For 3 weeks, whoever did this was living in that apartment, eating from the fridge, and sleeping on the floor, right alongside the rotting body. And honestly, if the story ended there, it would be enough to give you nightmares for the rest of your life." But there was one final detail. The detective shared a detail that Mark and Jessica will never, ever be able to unhear. The detective explained that the killer hadn't just been wandering aimlessly around the apartment. In the living room, directly above Mark and Jessica's bedroom, the carpet had been intentionally peeled back to expose the bare floorboards. And sitting right there, positioned perfectly over the metal floor vent that connected down into Mark and Jessica's room, was a single metal folding chair. For 3 weeks, while the apartment filled with the unimaginable stench of decay, the killer hadn't just been hiding. They had been sitting in that chair, in the pitch black, just listening to Mark and Jessica sleep. Splintered, the Staten Island House of Horrors. You know, when detectives talk about a messy crime scene, they usually mean a struggle, a knocked-over lamp, a rug pushed out of place, maybe some blood spatter on the baseboards. But the 2-story vinyl-sided house on Elmwood Park Drive in Staten Island wasn't just messy, it was excavated. End drywall was ripped out in jagged 3-foot chunks. The stuffing from the living room sofa was piled up like freshly fallen snow. Floorboards, solid oak floorboards, had been pried up with what looked like a heavy iron crowbar. And in the center of it all lay 5'8" Diane Gallagher. N.N. And honestly, the detectives standing in that suffocatingly hot room in mid-July weren't just asking who killed Diane. They were looking at the shredded walls, the smashed ceramic tiles, the absolute frantic destruction of a quiet middle-class home, and asking, what on earth were they looking for? N.N. But before we step inside that house, we need to understand who Diane was. Because the brutality of the scene just doesn't match the reality of her life. And Diane was a fixture in Great Kills, a quiet, working-class neighborhood on Staten Island's South Shore. She was a retired pediatric nurse, 58 years old. She had lived in that same house for almost 30 years. Her husband, Tom, had passed away from cancer 5 years prior. And since then, it was just her and a golden retriever named Buster. N.N. Her life was built on comfortable, mundane routines. She was the kind of neighbor who knew exactly when the street sweeper came by. Every morning at 7 a.m., she'd walk Buster down to the corner, holding a large Dunkin' iced coffee. Her neighbors knew her schedule down to the minute. You'd hear the distant, steady hum of traffic from Highland Boulevard, the occasional roar of a lawnmower, the thud of the morning paper hitting the driveway. She was the neighbor who would grab your Amazon packages and put them behind your planter so they wouldn't get stolen. She was safe. She was deeply, profoundly normal. None, which brings us to Tuesday, August 12th. None. It's about 85 degrees out with that thick, oppressive East Coast humidity that makes the air feel heavy in your lungs. It's 4 p.m. Diane's next-door neighbor, a retired sanitation worker named Mike, is out front wrestling with a tangled garden hose. And he happens to glance over at Diane's driveway. Her silver Honda CR-V is parked there, right where it always is. But something is off. And at first, it's just a tiny detail, a minor glitch in the suburban matrix. Diane's trash cans are still sitting at the curb. The garbage truck came through at 10 a.m. Diane, times never times, leaves her cans out past noon. She was meticulous about it. And Mike wipes the sweat off his forehead and walks over to pull the cans up her driveway. And that's when he notices the front door. It's open. Not wide open. Just cracked, maybe 2 or 3 inches. A stack of mail, junk mail, mostly, a couple of Valpak coupons, and a utility bill is wedged in the brass slot, fluttering slightly in the sluggish summer breeze. N, Mike stops. The neighborhood is suddenly very quiet. The hum of the traffic seems to fade into the background. He calls out her name. Diane? Nothing. At that point, it made sense to just assume she left it open for a breeze, or maybe she was in the backyard. People don't immediately jump to murder. We rationalize. We tell ourselves, it's nothing. N. But as Mike walks up the 3 concrete steps to her porch and pushes that heavy wooden door open, the first thing that hits him isn't a sight, it's a smell. A thick, suffocating wave of raw plaster dust, stale air, and the sharp, undeniable metallic scent of blood. Mike didn't want to step any further inside. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to turn around, go back to his driveway, and call 911. But he had known Diane for 20 years. So he took a breath, pushed the door open a few more inches, and stepped into the foyer. The first thing he registered was the sound. It was the frantic, muffled scratching of dog paws coming from somewhere deep inside the house. Buster. Then his eyes adjusted to the dim light. What Mike saw didn't make sense. It was as if a localized tornado had touched down exclusively inside Diane's living room. The floral sofa, the one she kept meticulously vacuumed, was gutted. Foam stuffing was scattered across the hardwood floor like dirty snow. But it was the walls that made Mike freeze. The drywall had been ripped open. Huge, jagged sections of sheetrock were torn down to the wooden studs, exposing the pink fiberglass insulation and electrical wiring underneath. And then he looked down the hallway. Diane was lying near the entrance to the kitchen. We won't dwell on the gruesome details of the scene, but suffice it to say, it was immediately clear that she was gone. The violence inflicted upon her was staggering, completely incongruous with the quiet, sun-drenched suburban street outside. Mike stumbled backward, his heavy work boots crunching over chunks of plaster. He barely made it to the porch before he pulled out his cell phone with shaking hands. When the NYPD from the 122nd precinct arrived, they taped off the perimeter, pushing the growing crowd of whispering neighbors back behind the police cruisers. Detectives stepped into the house, and immediately they formed a working theory. At that point, it made perfect sense. Staten Island, like a lot of American suburbs, was quietly battling a brutal opioid epidemic. Property crimes, specifically aggressive home invasions, had seen a sharp uptick. Junkies breaking in, looking for cash, jewelry, or prescription painkillers. It was a tragic, but common, narrative. The working theory was simple. A burglar breaks into the house, thinking it's empty. They are desperate, maybe high, tearing the place apart in a frantic search for a hidden safe or a stash of valuables. Diane comes home from her morning walk with Buster, catches the intruder in the act, and the burglar panics. It's a burglary gone horribly, tragically wrong. It's a neat explanation. It gives the chaos a shape. It's the kind of story that makes the neighbors lock their doors a little tighter at night, but ultimately lets them sleep, believing it was just a random, unlucky encounter. But honestly, the longer the crime scene investigators stayed in that house, the more that theory began to disintegrate. It started with the small things. The artifacts of the investigation that just didn't line up. If this was a desperate junkie tearing the house apart for quick cash, why was Diane's purse sitting right there on the kitchen island? Inside it, investigators found her wallet, completely untouched, with $400 in crisp $20 bills. They moved to the bedroom. Diane's jewelry box was sitting open on her dresser. Inside, her diamond engagement ring and a heavy gold necklace were sitting right on top. On the desk in the corner, a brand new $2,000 MacBook Pro was resting in plain sight. A panicked burglar doesn't leave behind untraceable cash and high-end electronics. And then there was the destruction itself. When the adrenaline faded and the detectives really looked at the damage, the frantic search theory completely collapsed. The walls weren't just smashed in a blind rage. When you looked closely at the edges of the ruined drywall, you could see straight, deliberate lines. Someone hadn't just taken a hammer to the walls, they had used a utility knife to score the sheetrock before prying it away in neat 3-foot sections. In the master bedroom, the heavy oak floorboards hadn't been randomly splintered. Someone had taken a crowbar and methodically popped them up one by one, exposing the subfloor beneath. This wasn't a frantic, panicked search. This was an excavation. Someone had spent hours in this house, dismantling it piece by piece. Which brings us to the most chilling detail of all. The detail that completely shatters the idea of a panicked intruder. When officers finally located Buster, the golden retriever, he wasn't cowering under a bed or injured. He was locked safely inside the downstairs half bathroom. And sitting right next to him on the tile floor was a freshly filled bowl of water. A desperate burglar doesn't pause a frenzied home invasion to make sure the family dog is hydrated. The realization settled over the detectives like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The killer hadn't been surprised by Diane. They had dealt with Diane first. And then, with the homeowner dead on the floor and the dog safely locked away, they took their time. They weren't looking for cash. They were looking for something hidden inside the very bones of the house. And whatever it was, Diane had died because of it. When crime scene unit technicians finally peeled back the rest of the splintered drywall in the master bedroom, they found it. A rectangular cavity, exactly 14.5 inches wide, sitting flush between two wooden 2x4 studs. There were fresh scrape marks on the surrounding wood. 4 heavy-duty lag bolts lay discarded on the subfloor. Someone hadn't just been looking for something. They had known exactly what was there, a hidden wall safe. Detectives brought Diane's daughter, Emily, into the precinct. They asked her about the safe. Emily looked confused. She explained that her father, a retired Staten Island sanitation worker who passed away 5 years earlier, had installed a safe in the late 90s. He was an old-school guy who didn't entirely trust banks. He used to joke at family barbecues that his real retirement fund was in the walls. But Emily told them something else. Diane had emptied that safe years ago. She had moved the money into a mutual fund shortly after her husband died. So, who still thought the money was there? Who knew the exact layout of the house? And, more importantly, who did Buster the Golden Retriever know well enough to let them lock him in a bathroom without barking his head off and alerting the neighbors? It wasn't a sophisticated forensic dragnet that broke the case, it was a smudge. A single partial thumbprint lifted from the rim of Buster's stainless steel water bowl. When they ran it through the system, it didn't ping a career burglar or a desperate drifter. It pinged a 8-year-old local guy with a minor DUI record. His name was Tommy. He was Diane's nephew. And honestly, that's when the reality of this case shifts from a terrifying home invasion to something so much darker, because it means the killer didn't break in. He was invited. Let's reconstruct that Tuesday morning. Tommy knocks on the door around 9 a.m. Diane smiles, opens it, and lets her nephew in. We know this because investigators found a second coffee mug sitting in the kitchen sink, still containing a splash of French vanilla creamer, Diane's favorite. They sat at the kitchen island, they drank coffee. And at some point, Tommy, who had been quietly spiraling into gambling debt, asked for a loan. When Diane refused, the nephew she had babysat, the kid she bought Christmas presents for, picked up a heavy cast iron skillet from the stove. He didn't hesitate. After Diane fell, Tommy didn't panic. He calmly walked Buster to the half bath. He filled the water bowl, leaving that single thumbprint behind. And then he went out to his truck, grabbed his utility knife and a crowbar, and spent 3 hours methodically tearing his aunt's house apart, looking for a ghost fortune. For the family, Tommy's arrest wasn't a relief. It was a second death. The quiet Staten Island neighborhood where Diane lived, the kind of place where people leave their garage doors open and everyone knows everyone was fundamentally shattered, Emily didn't just lose her mother. She realized she had been sitting across the Thanksgiving table from her mother's murderer. The trial was a quiet, suffocating affair. Tommy sat there, staring blankly at the defense table, barely looking up when the judge handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole. But there is one final detail about this case. A detail that stays with the detectives long after the file was boxed up and sent to the archives. When police executed a search warrant on Tommy's apartment, they found the walls safe in his garage. He had used an angle grinder to cut through the heavy steel door. The detectives looked inside, expecting to find something. But they found exactly what Emily had told them they would find. It was completely empty. except for a thin layer of dust and a small faded Polaroid photograph of Diane and her late husband tucked into the back corner. Tommy had murdered his aunt, dismantled her home, and destroyed his entire family for a metal box containing absolutely nothing.